Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. I'm Pascal Luta, and I am joined today again by Ambassador Chas Freeman, former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia and top official in the U.S. government for many years. Chas, welcome back.
Thanks, Pascal. Good to be with you.
Chas, we are speaking today, March 27th. It is 1 day. We are 1 day short of a full month of war with Iran, or the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran. February 28th, it started a sneaky surprise attack while negotiations in Geneva were still ongoing. Can you give us an update and your assessment of where we stand after 4 weeks?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Iran has what is called escalation dominance. It has adopted a policy that I have likened to Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope policy, meaning stand there, take all the punishment that the other side delivers to you, and let it exhaust itself. And I think this war has now gone through a series of phases. Iran had been waiting until the United States and Israel exhausted their self-defense capabilities against missile attack. It kept its more sophisticated missiles in storage for that moment. I think the level of ferocity of the American attack has been tremendous. It has been a huge demonstration of the ability of the United States to project power halfway around the world with enormous ferocity. But in the first 5 days of this war, which as you indicated is almost a month old now, 800 Patriot missiles were fired. The annual production rate is 750. So in 5 days, the whole year's stockpile of these weapons was fired off. And we've now come to the point where it's pretty clear that neither Israel nor the United States has the capacity to defend effectively against Iranian missiles. So Israel's taking quite a battery. We don't know how bad that is because Israeli military censorship is very effective. And the mainstream media respect that censorship. TikTok, which was once a source of direct information, has essentially been bought by the Zionist lobby in the United States and does not provide the insights that it once did on this matter. Meanwhile, Israel is, of course, taking advantage of the cover of the war to pursue its long-term objective of annexing southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. And it is carrying out pogroms and ethnic cleansing activities generally in the West Bank with a new level of intensity. So I guess I would sum all this up by saying that Iran has suffered enormous physical damage, but its strategic plan, its strategy is intact. Its capabilities to conduct that strategy seem to be intact, and it is standing its ground. The United States, under Donald Trump, appears to be increasingly desperate to get out of this war. Israel wants the United States to continue it because the Israeli objectives are very clear. They are to expand Israeli territory, to pursue the project of Greater Israel, meaning an Israel that extends from the Euphrates to the Nile, and in this process to annex lands adjacent to the current Israeli state in Lebanon, in Syria, and so forth. And basically, Israel is trying to annihilate the Iranian state. The American objective began with regime change, which hasn't happened. And in fact, the United States objectives in this have been very muddled and incoherent, but they've included a whole variety of particular items, for example, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. But the actual effect of the attacks has been to ensure that Iran will now build a nuclear weapon. And if Iran builds a nuclear weapon, we can expect the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, and others, Iraq, to follow their example. We also can see knock-on effects as far away as Pacific Asia, where you are. I think this will stimulate an active reconsideration by Japan of the policy of nuclear latency. It will certainly stimulate South Korea, where the public is strongly in favor of building nuclear weapons to counter the North Korean nuclear arsenal, to do so. So I think we're about to see a major wave of proliferation. The second effect is, of course, that having fired off a huge percentage of existing munitions stockpiles, the United States has weakened itself internationally at the global level. So if there were a Taiwan contingency, for example, the United States would not have the ability to deal with that effectively. We have actually begun to strip weaponry out of Pacific Asia, moving THAAD batteries out of Korea, South Korea, Patriot batteries, scavenging. And now, of course, a further knock-on effect is that weapons destined for Ukraine are now being considered for diversion to this war. So this has been a disaster in terms of the American overall global military posture. It also, of course, has done huge reputational damage to the United States because of many factors, obvious subservience to Israeli direction. Very odd thing that the United States now has a policy which has been outsourced to Israel. The tremendous application of force has not accomplished its purpose of breaking the will of Iran. Iran is defiant. The administration is, I think, quite desperate domestically. It sees the consequences in terms of fuel prices at the gas station. It sees inflation. We are discovering that the Persian Gulf is not only a major source of oil and gas, but central to the production of all sorts of agricultural and industrial inputs. For example, about 60% of plastics, about half of the world's fertilizer supply, sulfur, helium, things that are essential for modern industry, modern agriculture. And this is the planting season in the Northern Hemisphere, and there will not be the fertilizer to sustain a crop at normally expected levels. So the long-term effects are considerable, but even in the short term, we're seeing the consequences of Iran's transformation of the Strait of Hormuz from a freeway to a toll road. Yeah. Basically, if you do a deal with Iran, as China, India, Japan, Turkey, possibly others have done, and Russia, if you do a deal with Iran, when you go through, you're basically going through a toll booth, you take a ticket, you hand over some cash when you get through the strait. And interestingly, the payments are now in Chinese yuan, not in dollars, which is a signal of another problem, which is the impact on the global currency market and reserve currencies, more particularly trade settlement procedures, which are moving away from the dollar now with quite rapid speed. So this is a lot going on, but I have not finished. This is Friday morning for you in Tokyo, Thursday night here in New Hampshire. And Donald Trump has basically canceled his program for tomorrow. He has also said that he's postponing the deadline for attacking Iranian energy production and transport facilities. This has all of the odor of previous use of deception to mount a surprise attack. We know that the Marines will be in place tonight or tomorrow morning in the Arabian Sea. The 82nd Airborne has moved. The Special Forces are in place. And I think we can probably anticipate some kind of assault on Iran tomorrow. Well, perhaps your time today, but I would say Saturday in the weekend in Pacific Asia, perhaps Friday, perhaps Saturday here in the United States. So this is coming to a dangerous point. And the Iranians seem to be quite prepared for an infantry assault. And they have said, this is what they've been waiting for. Y'all come near, said the spider to the fly. And so we don't know what's going to happen, but it's obviously some sort of turning point.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube. And although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalluta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video. I talked yesterday to Muhammad Marandi and he told me exactly that. Look, they're probably going to invade us, one of our islands probably. And in that case, we know exactly what we're going to do. Well, why would the US contemplate something like this? I mean, do you think the rationale of some of these people is that in the best case scenario, we actually capture and keep that place? In the worst case scenario, we have a mass slaughter and a lot of body bags coming back, and then we will all have a rally around the flag moment where people at home go like, oh no, the Iranians killed our innocent soldiers. Do you think something like that is the motivation? I mean, it seems so foolish because obviously the Iranians can just shell these people if they come.
Well, we never know. You never know what will happen in war or in a battle. So, the possibilities range from a repetition of Gallipoli to, something more successful for the United States. It very much depends what the targets are. For example, I've thought from the beginning that the logical target for the Marines would be Abu Musa and the Lesser Tones, which are islands in dispute between Iran and the UAE. They were seized by the Shah in 1971 for Iran from British control as the British relinquished their control of what became the United Arab Emirates. That taking them would gratify the Emirates. It would provide a foothold in the Strait of Hormuz for American contest of Iranian control of the strait. So that is one possibility. There are others, a lot of talk from Israel in particular, about taking Karg Island, which is well up the Gulf, actually much closer to Kuwait than to the United Arab Emirates, and is the principal export station for Iranian oil. I think Israel has given up on its idea of regime change. It is busily murdering all of the people, however, who might speak for Iran in a negotiation. It doesn't want a negotiated end to this. It wants to collapse the Iranian state. And it imagines that if the United States were to seize control and retain control of Karg Island, this would incapacitate the Iranian state by depriving it of its principal source of revenue. So that is, I think, the Israeli reasoning in proposing that target. There are other possible targets which have been mentioned. Keshem Island, which is off Bandar Abbas, the main port in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Chabahar, which is outside the strait and the main port city, ironically, part of the north-south corridor that the Biden administration proposed to bypass Chinese Silk Road east-west corridors. This would be a transportation corridor from Bombay through Chabahar, overland to St. Petersburg. Anyway, so there are plenty of potential targets, none of them easy to deal with. The Iranians probably are prepared for all of these, and we will see what happens. I think Donald Trump is talking about fictitious negotiations with the Iranians. The Iranians have been very clear that they will not negotiate. They are not interested in a ceasefire. They are interested in achieving their objectives. Those objectives are the incapacitation of Israel, or at least the restoration of deterrence for Israel by inflicting sufficient pain on Israel to ensure that it will not contemplate attacking Iran in future, and the removal of the American military presence from the Persian Gulf. Another objective, of course, had been the removal of American sanctions on Iranian oil sales. Ironically, they have achieved that because of the American concern with oil prices. The Treasury Secretary, Mr. Besant, has lifted the sanctions on Iranian oil and also on Russian oil, by the way. I did not mention another knock-on effect, which I should, and that is in Ukraine. I think the Russians have paused their offensive. They're waiting for the weapons that would have gone to Ukraine to be diverted, and Ukraine, therefore, to be weakened. There's no point in pressing an attack when the enemy is about to be partially disarmed. So I think there are those implications as well of what is going on, which is certainly bad news for Mr. Zelensky, and he appears to understand that. I guess I should conclude by mentioning one other thing, and that is that it's very obvious that Mr. Witkoff, Stephen Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are no longer considered worthwhile interlocutors by Iran or by the Russians. Basically, the Russians will open the door and listen to them, but they have no expectation that they will be able to deliver anything other than deception. The same with the Iranians, except they won't even listen to them. What appears to be going on is texting by Witkoff to Arabchi not replying, except to say no. no negotiations. More recently, a 15-point proposal that's been passed through Pakistan to the Iranians. It is a ridiculous proposal. It actually proposes everything, that Iran accept everything that it has consistently refused to accept. And it reflects Donald Trump's very mistaken notion, voiced by his spokeswoman, Caroline Leavitt, that Iran has been defeated. But the opposite is true. Iran has been badly battered, but its will has not been broken. It has not been defeated. And as we all know, wars do not end until one party admits defeat. Iran does not admit defeat. In fact, as I indicated at the outset, the party being defeated is Israel and the United States, as the objectives we set for ourselves are met with counterproductive results, and as we exhaust our munitions. We can attack Iran, we can do great damage to Iran, but we can no longer defend Israel effectively. And that is an Iranian objective that has been achieved.
What do you make out of these statements by Donald Trump that Iran must open the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, it sounds to me again like the Iran must never build a nuclear weapon, which is something that Iran at the time always said. We are not building a nuclear weapon. We don't have it. We don't want it. We've got a fatwa against it. So we are in agreement on that one. And the United States kept talking about it, talking. And now it says like, no, must open the strait. But we know the ships can go through the strait. If you're a friend of Iran, you can go through.
For a fee, yes. For a fee. And, you know, one of the issues the Iranians have raised is the long-term control of the Strait of Hormuz. And to operate it like the Suez Canal, with a fee for transit. At some points, they've indicated that the legal framework for such a toll arrangement could be multinational. That is, presumably the Gulf Arabs could share in the revenue as well as pay the tolls. So it's not clear how that might work out. But Donald Trump appears to be under the impression that the strait is closed. There's a lot of talk of mining of the strait. I don't think that's occurred. Why would Iran mine a passageway from which it's making money, in which its own ships transit? This, of course, has become an issue in U.S.-Japan relations because Japan possesses the only really effective minesweeping force among American allies. And as the United States has wanted it to do as it did after the 1990-91 Gulf War to liberate Kuwait, Japan, once the combat was over, Japan did send minesweepers to clear the mines from the Persian Gulf that Saddam Hussein had released. But, you know, Japan is in no mood to do that. And of course, Donald Trump is now railing against NATO as completely useless, which, of course, is entirely consistent with his mistaken notion of NATO, not as a defensive alliance to defend Europe with American support, but as a group of auxiliary forces to be called on by the United States whenever we need them for expeditionary use elsewhere, Afghanistan, now the Persian Gulf. No European country has accepted this invitation. In fact, one of the main effects of this request and the other mad gyrations of Donald Trump has been that some Europeans are beginning to say we should leave NATO, we should expel the American bases. The clearest voices are those of Spain, which has in fact banned the use of bases on its territory to support American power projection against Iran, and where there have been large demonstrations calling for exit from NATO and the closure of the American bases. Elsewhere in Europe, the French and the British have accommodated American demands, which is, the French are apparently negotiating behind the scenes with the Iranians about free passage through the strait, as are the Italians. The Italians are in a better position to achieve that, given their relatively moderate stance on this war. The French have very little prospect, I think, of getting Iranian permission for their ships to go through the strait. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's not going in any direction that should please either Israel or the United States.
No, I was wondering though about the Gulf states. Professor Marandi, who of course is on a very, very Iranian line and interpretation of things, he says, look, the Gulf states, they are monarchies, little dictatorships, and they are 100% dependent on the United States. They do not have their own will. They do not have agency. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, a little bit different, but still under very, very heavy U.S. Political control. Do you share that assessment, or do you?
No, I don't. I don't agree with my friend Mohammed at all about that. I think these are countries that do have agency. They're quite independent. They have made a bad bet. They bet that having American forces on their territory would enable their defense. It has instead invited attack. And I think in terms that we were talking earlier about possible seizure of islands in the Strait of Hormuz that are claimed by the UAE, then the Iranians have said that there is a, quote, neighboring country that is colluding with the United States in the proposed attack on them, and that they will devastate that country. So I think the retaliation against the UAE, if there is such an attack, is going to be quite fierce. The Gulf states have a terrible dilemma. They made a bad bet. It's turned out that the United States not only cannot defend them against Iran, and by the way, that's something that's not going to change after this war. That is a lesson that will persist. There is no defense against Iran except a diplomatic defense. Diplomacy can reduce threats. That's one of its main purposes. Rapprochement can eliminate threats. As Abraham Lincoln said, when I befriend an enemy, I lose an enemy and make a friend. This is the appropriate approach. But it's very hard for the Gulf Arabs. They're under attack at the moment. The only feasible defense for them is from the United States. So you hear some of them, talking quite fiercely about the need to do major damage and reduce Iran to impotence. That is a fiction. It is a fantasy. It will not happen. And they're going to have to come to grips with that. And in the end, they do have agency. They do have alternatives. Those alternatives are, however, diplomatic, not military.
One of the points Mr. Marandi was making was that the U.S. protection is not just against the outside, it's also against the inside, in which these Gulf governments are actually ruling over populations that are quite unhappy with the way that they are doing things. So it's kind of a double function that the U.S. has. What are your thoughts on that one? And secondly, in my view, I mean, this should actually increase the incentive of the Gulf states to at some point just declare neutrality and say, like, look, we are politically not with the U.S. anymore. These bases are here because they're here, but they're not part of our sovereign territory. We actually abrogate our military relationship with the United States. Do you think this kind of thinking is actually happening? And how realistic do you think it might be?
Well, I would dispute the notion that the United States is the defender of the internal political order in each of these states. For example, in 1979, when extremists seized control of Mecca, while the United States was present in the background, supplying intelligence, it was the French who came to the aid of Saudi Arabia and evicted the extremists from Mecca. And I think, generally speaking, these states are, as Mohammed Marandi indicates, they are effectively police states. They have exhaustive surveillance capabilities, many of them derived from Israeli technology, which ironically was perfected in the suppression of the Palestinians. But this is useful for their control. The United States is involved in intelligence liaison relationships with them that are focused on terrorism, both against the rulers and against the United States. So there is an overlap there. But it is not a military commitment to defend them against their own people. And each of these countries is, however, is quite different. You have in, for example, the UAE, a very small, and Qatar for that matter, a very small minority of native Arab rulers and populace, with a huge number of guest workers from all over the place: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and so forth. Saudi Arabia has been reducing the proportion of foreign workers in an effort to build a work ethic and jobs for its own people. The others haven't tried that, and seem to be quite happy to operate with captive workforces on their territory. So Kuwait, of course, has a very large population of people who are stateless, resident in Kuwait, the so-called Bidun. Bahrain is majority Shiite, and many of them sympathetic to Iran, but it has a Sunni royal family. And so Oman is, quite distinctive, and it has much less oil and gas, and therefore a greater work ethic. And it has scrupulously maintained neutrality in terms of Gulf politics. So each of these countries is different, and that belies the thesis that they're somehow under American control. Of course, they do have close relations with the United States, especially military relations. The United States has been the principal vendor of weapons to them. Some services, armed services among them, have other relationships. For example, the Royal Saudi Navy is mostly French supplied. The Chinese and the Russians have begun to make inroads in the arms markets there. But the main relationship militarily is one of arms sales and the maintenance of systems. But those systems have failed in their defense of these small states against Iranian attack. They have not been effective. They've been very expensive, but they do not effectively deal with the Iranian threat from drones or, for that matter, ballistic missiles. Now, the one thing that is most dangerous here for these countries, and must indeed lead them to the kind of thinking you suggested they would rationally have, how do they phase out the American military presence in their own interest, is that some of them are entirely dependent on desalinated water. Water is essential for life. 70% of the water in Saudi Arabia is from desalination. I think 90% in Kuwait. I don't know the percentage in Qatar, but it's high. UAE is a little lower, maybe 50-40%, dependent on desalination. The Iranians have the ability to take out those desal plants very easily. And they have an excuse to do so because they charge that the United States took out the desalination plant on Hesham Island, which is off Bandar Abbas, and where there's some 30 villages that are now without water. So we've set a precedent. And this whole war is going on in terms of tit for tat. Escalation by Israel or the United States is met with counter-escalation by Iran. So there's a bombing of Natanz, the main uranium enrichment center in Iran, in return for which Iran strikes just outside the reactor in Dimona in Israel, showing that it can strike the reactor, but not doing so, because to do that would be a drastic step that might invite a nuclear attack from Israel and would also create a cloud of radiation that would poison southern Israel and part of Egypt. So we're poised at a moment when and if what I fear will happen over the weekend does occur, the Iranian retaliation will be fierce, quite aside from whatever happens to any invasion force that the United States fields in wherever it is it encounters the Iranians. There will be missile attacks on facilities in the Gulf states and in Israel. The targeting will be directly influenced by whatever is targeted in Iran. And I think when Donald Trump has proposed to blow up Iranian oil and gas facilities, and told by the Iranians, if you do that, we will blow up the facilities in the Gulf states and possibly the desal plants too. I think that even, he basically doesn't give a damn about anybody but himself. But I think that is sufficiently sobering for him to have issued a number of deadlines and then suspended them. I don't think those deadlines have any real value, by the way. I think they are part of his effort to manipulate the U.S. stock market by pretending there are negotiations in progress. The market responds directly to these claims for a time, and then reality sets in and the effect is lost. But he also is trying to show that he's in charge, and bolster his argument that Iran has somehow been defeated, which it hasn't been.
There is an argument out there that overall the talk about the United States being heavily worried about the price of oil and natural gas is actually a ruse, and that the entire situation where the Gulf production capacities are being taken out comprehensively is actually something that's in the interest of the United States because it hurts China. because it hampers China's economic development, and it increases prices, and it increases the dependence of Europe on US LNG and oil. So overall, the whole oh no, it's so bad that prices are going up is really just a way to incentivize Iran to keep doing what they're doing and shut off this very strategic supply of hydrocarbons. What do you make out of that argument?
I think that's a rationalization of the effects of what is happening, finding a justification for them that is really very unsound and not very credible. Yes, there are people in the United States who are fixated on competition with China and holding China back and so forth. By the way, China's doing very well out of this, as is Russia. Oil prices have gone up. Russian capacity to export oil has been damaged by Ukrainian attacks, but Russian revenue is going up, not down. And the Chinese, who are the leaders globally in renewable energy, are much better positioned, not only because of the renewable energy, but because of a huge strategic petroleum reserve. They are much better positioned than anyone to survive the supply shock. By the way, Europe is in about 2 weeks is going to run out of a lot of fuel, and so Europe is definitely one of the places where the greatest collateral damage from this stupid war is landing. I mentioned Ukraine earlier as another victim of this, so no, I don't believe that. I think yes, the United States did apparently knock out the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. I was very amused to read something in The Economist magazine, which normally is a serious journal, to the effect that the Russians suspended gas sales to Europe. I don't think that is quite correct. I think Europe and the United States conspired to deprive Europe of gas supplies, with disastrous effects for the European economies, especially that of Germany. When you combine that with the suspension of nuclear power in Germany, it's been quite devastating. Anyway, there's a lot of revisionism going on. I mean, we're used to this. The war in Ukraine was, quote, unprovoked, unquote. Nothing happened to justify a Russian decision to invade, which they did, not legally, but with some political justification, I would say. Anyway, a lot of revisionism going on. Now we have UN resolutions endorsed by Europeans that said that blame Iran for the attacks on Persian Gulf countries, forgetting that it was not Iran that started this war. And retaliation is justified under international law and practice. But, we are used to inverting the truth. Black becomes white, up becomes down. Here we are.
The hypocrisy is again extreme, but the interesting thing is, of course, that it's becoming so transparent that even in Europe and the United States, it's really, really, really hard to still put spin on that. I mean, it's getting so hard that you can almost see the desperation in which some of mainstream media journalists are trying to push, like the Iranians, to say something. But may I just ask you about the nature of how we see how this war unfolds? Because a very good analyst, Arnaud Bertrand, made that observation that the wars that this one has been compared to previously are actually bad fits. The Iran war is nothing like the proxy war in Ukraine. Afghanistan and Vietnam were guerrilla warfare, and even Iraq, after 5 weeks there was complete superiority and Saddam was basically out, right? So this is a kind of a different animal now in terms of how the fighting happens, and Iran is kind of not only standing its ground, but it's much more symmetrical, the warfare, than what we have seen in other cases. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's essentially correct. As you know, I prefer the word multinodal to describe the organization of the world that is emerging. And it's very clear that a middle-ranking power like Iran now has the capacity to stand off the American superpower. It has planned for 20 years how to do this. It has a strategy. It has developed the technological capabilities required to implement that strategy, meaning underground storage for its factories and its inventory of weapons. It's prepared to take damage. In that regard, there is an analogy, I think, with the North Vietnamese, who also were subjected to brutal bombing and stood their ground and eventually won in Vietnam. I agree with Arnaud that this is not analogous to Afghanistan or the invasion of Iraq. it's a very different thing. And I would say here that one of the most important elements of this, which should not be overlooked, is that Israel has finally met a competitor that will stand up to it. It has been fighting asymmetric wars where it had total air superiority. There was no air defense, there was no air force, there was no heavy weaponry, there was no conventional army to oppose it. And that has been true of recent American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. But it is not true in this case. And so we're also seeing, I would say, echoes of the drone warfare that has been pioneered in Ukraine. Europe now has two very, very combative armed forces. One is Russian, the other is Ukrainian. And they outclass everybody else by virtue of experience and innovation. And they're very similar people, of course, different but similar, brave, innovative, and steadfast, willing to take huge casualties in pursuit of objectives that they agree with. So Iran is showing itself in that regard somewhat like Ukraine, perhaps, or Russia. But there is another point here, and that is that just as the Russians have concluded there's no point in negotiating with the United States for an end of the war in Ukraine, that it has to be settled on the battlefield because the United States is duplicitous, incompetent, whatever the word is, Iran has reached the same conclusion. It's not going to negotiate an end to this. It has been very clear what its objectives are, and when it has substantially achieved those objectives, it will then be prepared for a discussion to reconcile the United States and presumably Israel to what it has accomplished, but not before that. And so this is something new for the United States. Here I will digress a little bit. The American way of war is basically formed in three or four experiences. Our Civil War, in which unconditional surrender, followed by the moral resurrection and reform of the enemy, was the plan. And World War I, where again unconditional surrender, followed by the reform of the enemy, was the plan. World War II, where unconditional surrender, followed by the reform of the enemy, was the plan. The Cold War, where unconditional surrender, not followed by much of an effort at reform, was the norm. And so this is the American way of war. This is very peculiar. Europeans and Asians understand that wars are fought to adjust relationships between states that can't be adjusted peacefully, and that they have purposes which are limited to specific objectives. And when those objectives are achieved, the war ends in a negotiation which recognizes the changes that have been achieved on the battlefield and reconciles both parties to the war, if there are two parties, to the results. This is the norm in history. Wars are fought, territory is lost or gained. There is then a negotiation which recognizes the change, not unconditional surrender or the annihilation of the enemy, or the imposition on the enemy of ideologically generated reforms. So here is the United States fighting Iran. Israel is a very similar idea. Annihilation is the Israeli objective, not negotiation. The only negotiations that have produced a modicum of peace for Israel have been forced on it by the United States. Camp David, Jimmy Carter basically compelled the Israelis to accept a compromise with Egypt, which they greatly resisted and resented. And in fact, Begin, the Israeli premier, the prime minister at the time, went into permanent retirement out of shame after he was forced to accept these terms, which contradicted the Greater Israel project. So Israel too has a sort of total warfare concept, no negotiation, and that is, of course, consistent with a point that they are now assassinating anyone they can who might have the ability to speak for Iran in a negotiation. They don't want the United States to have a negotiation with Iran. They want to annihilate Iran. They can't do it themselves. They want the United States to do it for them. But I think Donald Trump is getting cold feet. He is not enthusiastic about that anymore because it's not working, because it's going to cost him the midterm elections, because his own base of support, the MAGA movement, is splintering over this. there are prominent figures in that movement now who are really very critical of the Trump administration. He has essentially shattered the American alliance structure, as illustrated in the refusal of allies to come to American aid in the Gulf, or in the Strait of Hormuz. So this is indeed quite different from the short victorious wars, imposed peaces, and unconditional surrender demanded of enemies. This can only end in a negotiation, and Iran will determine when that negotiation happens, not the United States or Israel.
Yeah, it's a completely new constellation. And maybe a very last point just about U.S. the internal political process, which I wonder how you see it, because one person has been, to me, remarkably silent, and it's actually the only one who is constitutionally safe from the wrath of the U.S. president, which is his vice president, J.D. Vance. I mean, he obviously doesn't like this. He's obviously not very keen on this. This is kind of ruining his chances for being Donald Trump's successor, right? The way that Joe Biden made Kamala Harris absolutely impossible, but for him even more so with the Republicans. What is your assessment of him at the moment and the vice president in general?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. He's very unhappy with all this, not on board with it, embarrassed to have to defend this so he tries to avoid situations where he does have to defend it. I note that in connection with the Pakistani passing of messages and Pakistan's offer of a venue for a meeting between the United States and Iran, J.D. Vance is being offered up as the representative. That is in part because neither Witkoff nor Kushner are persona grata with the Iranians for entirely understandable reasons. So I'm not sure that J.D. Vance's prospects for succeeding Trump have been damaged as much as you imply. I've seen polls where his principal rival, Marco Rubio, for the succession to Trump, is way behind him in the polls. So it may be that J.D. Vance, who is evidently of the restrainer school in terms of foreign policy, can sit there and wait, and when this all goes totally awry, pick up the pieces. Yeah. So I'm not sure how that works, but he is clearly uncomfortable. Yes.
Constitutionally speaking, Donald Trump cannot fire him because he's directly elected as well. And secondly, if something happens to Donald Trump and incapacitates him, then it would be J.D. Vance who could convene cabinet in order to replace the U.S. president, or right to.
Well, I think under the 25th Amendment, the cabinet has to certify the president as unfit. This cabinet is itself unfit. Okay. It is the most incompetent and politically rigid cabinet, almost a cult-like cabinet that we've ever had. I don't think you're correct that J.D. Vance can't be fired. We have a precedent in that Richard Nixon fired Spiro Agnew as vice president.
Okay.
And he did that by bringing an impeachment proceeding. So the Trump cult, if it were sufficiently alienated from J.D. Vance, could potentially dislodge him from the vice presidency. I don't see that happening. It's purely theoretical. Yeah. Just as I don't see the removal. I think many people have come to the conclusion that Donald Trump is clinically insane. But I don't think that conclusion will result in his removal from office. I mean, we are witnessing the imperfections of the 25th Amendment procedure and of the American Republic and its constitutional arrangements for the American Republic, which worked very well for 250 years and which don't work now. So if we had a parliamentary system, Trump would be out. And by the way, Israel does have a parliamentary system, and I can very well see that, there may be no regime change in Iran, but there could be in Israel.
It would be one of these ironies of history, which history is littered with. But Ambassador Freeman, you gave us again wonderful insights with a lot of really very good points. So I thank you very much for this. People want to follow you, they should go to your homepage, which is chasfreeman.com.
No, chasfreeman.net. But all that has on it, that is an amateurish website I made myself. And since I'm an ignorant geezer, it was pretty clumsy. And all it has on it is prepared speeches that I've given. It doesn't have anything else. So the best thing to do is to do a search on YouTube, and you'll find all kinds of things, including, I think, your show. So thank you, Pascal, for inviting me, and I hope you have a pleasant day.
Everybody find Chas Freeman online, also on the other shows, also on NEMA. Ambassador Chas Freeman, thank you for your time today.